Welcome to another episode of the Practical SQL Server HADR show. My name is Edwin Sarmiento, and welcome to the show. If you're joining in for the very first time, thank you for joining in. The goal of these episodes, or the Practical SQL Server HADR show, is twofold. One, if you're a technical operator, meaning you're a systems engineer, you're a database administrator, or sysadmin, or sometimes even a developer who was just forced into building a high availability and disaster recovery system, I feel bad for that person who was, he was simply writing code. He's the only person who knows how SQL Server works. Even a slight idea, and all of a sudden he was given the responsibility to build a SQL Server high. I feel bad for that person. I used to be that person. Anyway, if you're a technical operator and you are in charge of either designing or deploying or managing a SQL Server high availability and disaster recovery solution, this is for you, where I share lessons learned, even those mistakes that I've made in the past, so that you don't have to make them yourselves. I like the fact that I've collected a lot of bloopers, hidden bloopers, that is. Although some of them you'll find on my blog post where I wrote, maybe I should start writing and going back to all of the mistakes that I've done in the past so that you can learn from them. That's one. Best practices, not your generic best practices, but best practices that apply specifically to your environment, where you can evaluate whether or not a best practice is something that you can apply to your existing environment. And if you're responsible for an already existing always-on availability group solution or any type of SQL Server high availability or disaster recovery solution, and you're clueless, like you don't know how to deal with it, you don't know what gotchas to expect, this is what these episodes are all about. Now, I did say twofold, right? If you're a decision maker or a team lead or manager, and you're in charge of a team and you're not quite sure whether or not this is the right solution for you, welcome, right? This week's episode focuses more on what I consider to be the business side of high availability and disaster recovery solution. And I do focus on non-technical aspects as well, because as technical professionals, that is something that we barely pay attention to. We're so focused on the technical details of the implementation, the deployment, management, troubleshooting, that we forget technology is here, and technology is made available to support business needs and business requirements. And whenever I come into a customer environment, or I get brought in as a consultant working with customers on whether it's a design of their new high availability or disaster recovery solutions, or an implementation, or even sometimes troubleshooting and management of it, one of the things that I do is go back into the business needs. Okay? And sometimes it is a challenge for technical professionals to answer questions that have something to do with what the business really needs. This is where I start bringing in stakeholders, the manager, the director, or people who make decisions on the technical implementations of the solution, because they're they're closer to the business needs more than the technical people, or we, the tech professionals. So I want to talk about this topic, the hidden costs that burn budgets, hidden costs of HADR solutions that burn budgets. Again, more often than not, when a company decides, or maybe your boss decides, hey, we want to implement this high availability and or disaster recovery solution, they already have something in mind. They have an idea of why they want to do this. Okay, and it's not just let's go do it. No, they go through the proper project planning. They treat this as a project. They plan for it. They resource it. They would test it out first. Again, the proper way of dealing with a high availability and disaster recovery solution. And part of that is really budget. Okay, and more often than not, when a project like this, or high availability or disaster recovery project, is planned ahead of time. They already have the budget for hardware, licensing, anything that is attached to the solution, like monitoring solutions, anything. They've already factored that in. And they would bring in a project manager to look at the budget as well, and then validate whether or not this is more than enough to go on with the project. Which is great, right? Because you really do want to count the cost of what it means to implement a very expensive. And I always tell people, and even my customers, high availability nowadays is a need. Back when I was starting out with this about 20 plus years ago, it's kind of like an afterthought, where if you're starting out, it's a startup or you're small to medium-sized business, sure, it's a nice to have. Now, okay, as businesses evolve fast, as the companies grow, they acquire more customers, and they enter into new markets, it becomes a need. It's no longer a nice to have, it's a need. So they now have to, make sure that their data platform solutions are highly available, because there is cost associated with downtime, right? And back then, it was a very hard sell. It's just like selling insurance. Like, you don't need health insurance if you're healthy, or so what most people think, right? But now it's necessary. With finance industries, for instance, there are regulations and compliance requirements for them to stay in that industry and operate within that industry, which is a little bit challenging, especially if you're transitioning from one industry to another and you're looking at how you can meet compliance and regulatory requirements. Now high availability becomes part of that. And again, I want to focus on hidden costs, because it's more than just licensing, although most of the time people are looking at the licensing cost, because that's a huge cost factor. So licensing hardware, of course, if you're not thinking of hardware, you're probably looking at moving to public cloud infrastructure, so that you're not really paying for upfront costs when it comes to hardware and licensing, but it's still a cost, right? I want to focus on hidden costs that most of the time we don't even think about when it comes to implementing any type of high availability and or disaster recovery solutions. Grab your pen and paper, start taking notes. Let's get on to hidden cost number one. I want to focus on three, because these are the most common costs, hidden costs that burn budgets. The first one is what I call the people tax. Again, we're going to be implementing this as humans, okay? Even though people are talking about automation and AI, we humans will be implementing these solutions. There is the human aspect of this. If you're implementing this and you're a full-time employee, you might be thinking, oh, there's no cost to the business. Well, there is, other than the fact that this might not be something that you do on a day-to-day basis. Meaning, if you're an operator, you're only taking care of day-to-day administrative tasks, and now you're part of the team that needs to implement a high availability or disaster recovery solution, you're now being given an additional responsibility. So as a full-time employee, the company has to factor that in as a cost. But I want to focus on what I call the other people tax, that is part of the hidden cost when you're implementing a high availability and or disaster recovery solution. One of them is called specialized training. Okay, specialized training. A lot of people who have been reaching out to me, sending me emails, reaching out on social media, even people in my mailing list. They've been working with SQL Server for quite a while, been a DBA or sysadmin for like close to a decade, but they have not worked with always-on availability groups, failover clusters in those years that they have been working as either a database administrator or sysadmin. Which means if the management decides, hey, we want to implement something like an always-on availability group or any type of SQL Server high availability solution, and you've never worked with that specific technology or that specific platform, then you need specialized training. You need it. Now, I've also seen cases where the company would outsource the building, the deployment, the management to a third party. Okay, meaning a managed services provider, they would outsource that because, again, they look at it as cost. Either or, whether you're taking care of it as a full-time employee or your management decides we'll outsource that to somebody else, they still need specialized training. They need the skills to properly build this, to properly configure this, to properly implement, to properly manage, and to properly troubleshoot this entire solution, whoever's building it, right? I've seen cases, I've worked with customers where somebody else built it because, you know, their consultants have the skills, and then they would hand it over to the full-time employees. When in fact that, you know, database administrators and sysadmins do not have the proper training to even manage this. Okay, and I'm pretty sure you've probably gotten that experience where you had an outage, you open a case with Microsoft, and then because Microsoft support, you know, first level support is outsourced to third-party vendor, and the vendor does not know anything, or probably not unaware. It's just that they do not have the first level support, does not have the proper training, the proper skills for them to manage the availability group. Then it would take time, and then they would escalate it to an escalation engineer. So you need specialized training, whether that's you, the person taking care of this, or somebody else, meaning an outsourced managed services provider. They need specialized training. Okay, part of that is staffing. I've already shown you the second one. Staffing. It's not enough for you to have people who can do the work. And I always tell my customers that it's not enough for you to have capable people, meaning senior escalation engineers or senior DBAs who have decades worth of experience and who have worked with always on availability groups. They are really, really, really good at this. There's no point in having those, but they're not available when something goes wrong. Okay, so staffing is more than just having capable people. You need to have both capable and available people. Not enough to have available people, like I said. Cases where a third-party vendor consulting company would come in, they're capable, they would build it, and then they would hand it over to internal employees or operations team, but the operations team are not capable. Sure, they're available, but they're not capable. You need to have both capable and available people to manage this, take care of this once it's in production. And that's part of the people tax. Okay. Next is administration, the day-to-day operations, the ongoing care and feeding. You have to factor that in, because you need people. And again, it doesn't matter if you have AI or automation or even monitoring solutions where you have like proper triggers so that when it identifies some issue, it resolves it. At the end of the day, when you have a high availability and or disaster recovery solution, you need to make sure that it works the way you expect it to work. So proper proactive administration is part of this, and we humans will still play a big part of this. And opportunity costs. I mentioned if you're a full-time employee and you're working on like day-to-day operations, and a new high availability and disaster recovery project is planned, either you go back to specialized training, you need to upskill, you need to train, but also part of that is now you will have to be pulled away from whatever you need to be doing on a daily basis so that you can focus your effort and attention onto this new project. Which means you will not be able to do things that other teams might want you to do. I've worked with customers where They're highly specialized on one area, and this is something that they haven't done before, so they needed to get trained on this. And because they're getting trained on always on availability groups, failover clustering, they have to set aside some projects and some activities that they have been doing as part of their normal day-to-day. One of my customers, they have generalists in place, meaning their full-time employees are systems engineers and systems administrators, and they barely do database administration work. But because the company is growing, most of the time they spend deploying servers, managing VMs, patching, and that's something that they do on a daily basis. But now that their company is growing, they need to specialize on administering and managing SQL Server. So now they're focused, they're redirecting their focus from their normal day-to-day to now taking care of databases. Again, opportunity cost. Either you resolve that by additional staffing, outsourcing to a third-party vendor or managed services provider. But if you don't, there's an opportunity cost that people who are doing normal day-to-day work would have to set aside what they've been doing to focus on this. Okay, people will always be a part of not just the day-to-day operations, but from start to finish. From the design, the implementation, the management, they will have to be a part of this. Okay, there is a huge tax on getting people involved, or sometimes a huge cost on not getting people involved. Okay, especially in large organizations where you have segregation of duties, and only the DBAs know that this is going to be the project that they're going to be working with, not realizing that they need to bring the network guys, the storage guys, the sysadmins, the VM admins, the hardware. You have to bring everybody as part of deploying a high availability and or disaster recovery solution for your data platform solutions. Okay, so that's the first one, the people tax. The second one is the consumption tax. The consumption tax. This is the cost associated with you now having the solution, it's now in production and part of the day-to-day operations. Okay. For instance, data center usage. You're going to be building an entire infrastructure. High availability solutions, you need at least 2 servers, at least. Where are you going to put that? If it's a physical server, well, now you have to think about power consumption, you have to think about cooling. If it's a VM, you start to think about storage and capacity even. Does your existing hypervisor, the physical machine hosting your hypervisor, does that have enough compute resource to handle additional workload? Okay, so that data center usage and storage. Okay, with a solution like always on availability groups, you're now, if you have 2 replicas, you now have to double your storage requirements for your databases. You have 3 replicas, you have to triple. You have 4 replicas, you have to quadruple. So you have to think about the consumption of IT resources or IT assets as part of implementing the solution. And then your networking. Okay? Think of it this way. Within availability group, if you only have a standalone instance, well, I'll just use whatever network I have. But now you replicate within availability group, you start to replicate data between primary and secondary, in addition to compute resources, in addition to storage resources. You need to have network resources available so you can replicate the data between your primary and your secondary. Okay, and then you're monitoring and tooling. One of the things that I ask customers who already have always on availability groups or any type of high availability solution in place is what kind of monitoring tools you use. And sometimes it's interesting when they say, well, we just have, the standard tools on Windows, like Windows Task Scheduler with Perfmon and alerting. you already spent the money on the hardware and licensing for your solution. You gotta have something that you could use to monitor this. I kind of liken this to buying a very expensive car, but not have the proper tooling on the dashboard. Doesn't make sense for you to drive a very expensive car, but not have a proper speedometer, not have a proper temperature gauge, not have a proper fuel gauge. Yeah, it does seem weird, right? You've already spent the money. You've already bought the licenses for a very expensive solution like SQL Server. You do the math. With Enterprise Edition licensing on a per core basis, that's expensive. You got to factor in the proper tooling. What kind of tools do you need to manage this? What kind of monitoring solutions do you need for this? That is part of your consumption tax. And as the company grows, like I said, the way I look at it is the data also grows. As the data grows, you need to scale up, meaning your data center usage would also go up. Oh, we need to add more compute resources. Again, if that's a physical machine, we need to add more CPU cores, which means we need to add more licenses, which means we need to factor in power consumption. We need to factor in cooling costs within the data center. It's one of the reasons why, again, public cloud infrastructure has picked up for the past couple of years, because this is part of your consumption tax. Okay? And as you need to scale up, you need to include costs of monitoring and the tooling to properly monitor and manage the entire solution. Okay? So we talked about the people tax. We've talked about consumption tax. The third one is the handshake tax. This is kind of interesting. There's this concept in economics where the market would eventually, what's the term I'm looking for? The market will eventually normalize based on the needs of individuals as market factors influence the provider and the consumer, meaning the one that's providing the solution, they would provide the solution, and then the consumer, based on their needs, everything will get normalized. But there is this thing called the handshake tax, meaning as you deploy solution into production, in addition to the consumption tax, there are things that you have to maintain and keep. In addition to the consumption tax on the technical side, we're looking at handshake tax when it comes to maintaining the solution, the non-technical demands of a technical solution. Okay. First one is audit. If you're in an industry that requires meeting compliance and regulatory requirements, then you need to have something that would do regular audits. I remember part of what we did when I was working as a data center engineer almost 20 years ago now. We do regular audits because we need to meet PCI compliance and HIPAA compliance as well. So we bring in auditors to make sure that our entire infrastructure is compliant with those standards and regulations. Otherwise, we are not allowed to operate the data center. Okay, not allowed to even host the data if we don't meet certain requirements. So again, with stuff like PCI, you have to think about, hey, how do we keep the data secure, right? And there are certain requirements when it comes to high availability and business continuity. So there will have to be like audit requirements, and I remember we had to do this every year. We had to pass audit checks depending on the regulatory requirements, and then make sure that by the end of the year we would file the paperwork to qualify, that we passed those audit checks. Okay. Then you have your documentation. It's not enough for you to just build something, implement something, cut over to production, and forget that we need something like documentation. Okay. Your documentation is something that you have to keep up to date. And of course, as technical professionals, it's something that we don't want to do. This is a necessary evil. In fact, someone mentioned that they found a lot of my articles on MS SQL tips, on my blog, on a vendor website, and they said, hey, you got really good documentation. And my typical response to that is twofold. One, that's for me. I forget stuff. So what better way for me to remember something is for me to write it down as if I would hand off that document to somebody who will have to either build this entire infrastructure or maintain it or monitor it or troubleshoot it. That's the purpose of why I write documentation. Do I like it? I've been writing documentation for so long and I still don't like it. I still don't, but it's a necessary evil. Okay. I've also seen customer environments where they have built documentation, meaning they've taken screenshots, they've documented the entire build process, but the build documentation does not reflect their current environment. Take into account, for instance, let's just use SQL Server 2022. In the build documentation, they have SQL Server 2022 RTM, but in their production environment, they have SQL Server 2022 with certain cumulative updates. So it doesn't reflect, the documentation does not reflect what they have in production, which is a little bit challenging when you need to rebuild the entire environment because of some catastrophic event. I'll be honest, I still don't like writing documentation, but it is a necessary evil. And that is part of the hidden cost that you need to take into account because it's an ongoing thing. Okay? Excuse me. Excuse me. Nobody likes writing documentation, but we still need to do it. Besides, part of the audit requirements is, hey, do you have updated documentation? And somebody would validate it. In order for you to keep your operations going and pass audit checks, you need to have proper documentation. Regular testing. I had to stop and pause because I couldn't count the number of times when excuse me, I've been called to a consulting project, an engagement. I will look at the documentation. They built a really good infrastructure, properly documented, properly configured, properly everything. And then I would ask them, when was the last time you did a DR test? And I'm not just talking about failing over to a DR environment. I'm also referring to when was the last time you restored your database backups? That's part of testing. Everything looks good on paper until you have to test it. Okay? I'll say that again because it's worth repeating. Everything looks good on paper until you have to test it. And the worst time to test your DR is when you're in a real disaster. Okay? I remember one of the projects that I worked on a couple of years back. Customer asked me to build the entire solution, both HA and DR. Customer wanted me to write the documentation for their DR exercise. I built a POC environment. I've tested the POC environment. I've written the DR document using the POC environment. So I've documented everything. Handed off, everything was approved. A couple of months later, I asked them, when was the last time you tested your DR? They haven't. They have not. And again, if you're in a regulated industry like finance, for instance, or even healthcare, this is something that you have to do on a regular basis. When I was working as a data center engineer, we did this on a quarterly basis. Restoring backups daily. Okay, there's a delay between restoring from backups, so it means what we are restoring today are backups from like 2 days ago, which is good, so long as we're guaranteeing that we're still meeting our recovery point and recovery time objectives. DR testing, failing over our production to DR. We do it quarterly, because we need to pass audit regulations. We need to pass compliance requirements. So we had to do this quarterly. This is also one of the reasons why I really love automation, because this is the only way for us to do this on a quarterly basis without spending an entire weekend on it. And part of that is also refining our documentation, where if we're testing things, we need to make sure that what we have in the documentation is exactly what's happening. If not, we refine the process, update the documentation, and do it again. That's a cost that you have to factor in. And of course, licensing creep, as you scale up, okay, you need more compute resources, maybe add more CPU cores. If it's a VM, no big deal. If you're licensing the physical host, you're already covered. But we're not just talking about compute licensing requirements for your data platform solutions like SQL Server per core licenses. What about monitoring? Now you're expanding your availability groups to additional replicas. You need to monitor. Oh, now you're expanding to multiple LUNs within your storage subsystem. They have to monitor those. So there's more than just the licensing for scale up or scale out. Other components, again, tooling and licensing of monitoring tools, that factors into licensing creep. So these are costs that you have to constantly think about when you're implementing a high availability and disaster recovery solutions. And it's not enough for you to simply think about, hey, we're building this, these are the costs, and that's it. We have to factor in these real hidden costs, like the people tax, the consumption tax, and the handshake tax. All of this, especially again if you're in a highly regulated industry where this should be part of the budget. And it's not just a project-based budget, but after cutting over to production, you've already rolled it out. You now have to think about operations and maintenance costs throughout the lifetime of the solution until we need to do another upgrade, we need to do another migration, and the cycle repeats itself. You have to factor that in. Otherwise, if you ran out of budget for your HADR solution, your project will eventually take longer because now we don't have the budget and resources to push this thing out into production. So you have to think of those as well. And again, as technical professionals, it's very difficult for us to see these because we're so focused on the day-to-day operations. These things mostly are what keeps your directors, your managers, your team leads awake at night, because they have to think about all of these things. And a new HADR solution, a new project for implementation, will take that into account. It's one of the reasons why, as a technical professional, your job is to constantly think of ways on how to efficiently do your work, do more with less. And I know that sounds like a cliche, but again, if not, business will always look for ways to cut down on cost. And guess what they're gonna do? Most of the time, they would lay people off because that's the easiest way, right? So always thinking about how to efficiently do more with less while at the same time meeting the business needs. And again, these are realistic costs. These are not something that, hey, we just thought of it. No, these are costs that you have to think about, not just during the planning phase, not just during the deployment phase, but throughout the life cycle of the solution once it goes out into production, until the time that you have to replace the entire thing and do the whole project planning, budget allocation again and again until as long as the business is in operation, right? Did I cover all three? Yes, I did cover all three, right? The people tax, the consumption tax, and the handshake tax. That is about it for this week's episode of the Practical SQL Server HADR show. And again, giving you some insights into what you need to prepare for. And in this case, hidden costs, okay? Hidden things that would eventually burn your budgets. Unexpected sometimes because people don't plan for it, but the more you're prepared for it, the more you plan for it, the more you'll be ready, not just during the design and implementation, but after cutting over to production, where you're taking care and maintaining the entire solution, right? If you need help with anything high availability and disaster recovery related, maybe again you're in that stage of planning, you're designing, you're looking at your business requirements and evaluating what solution would fit your requirements. Maybe you already have an existing solution, but you don't have, you didn't plan for the people tax, so now you don't have the right people, you don't have capable and available people who would take care of the solution. What else? Maybe you have issues and you couldn't figure out what is causing unexpected outages and unplanned downtimes. Or again, just having somebody look at your existing environment, having a second pair of eyes. Reach out. This is a link to my calendar page where you can pick and choose a time that works for you. Go to that link, that URL, pick a time that works for you, and we'll jump into what I call a strategy session. In the strategy session, we'll explore where you are at. Okay, are you in the planning and design stage? Are you in the implementation stage? Are you already in the day-to-day operation stage? And we'll explore what challenges you have. And once we're clear on those challenges, we'll come up with a strategy that would help you resolve whatever challenges that you have in that stage. Again, use that link on the screen, schedule a strategy session, and happy to help in any way I can. That is about it for this week's episode of the Practical SQL Server HADR show. Tune in again, and by the way, thank you for those. Thank you for feedback and comments. I get feedback and comments from people who are watching this. It's getting streamed on LinkedIn, Facebook, YouTube, and I get either DMs or sometimes people would send emails and provide feedback. In fact, some of the topics that I started incorporating in these episodes came from feedbacks and comments from those who have watched. So thank you. Really, really appreciate that. And it also drives the direction of some of the topics that I'm going to cover next within some of the future episodes. Right? And with that, I'll see you again next week.